What if the oldest chapters of human history are not missing, but misread? Imagine walking through a museum of stone, bronze, dust, and silence, believing you are looking at the beginnings of civilization, only to feel for a moment that you may actually be standing among its echoes. Not the first attempts of humanity, but the surviving fragments of something already old, when the first scribes dipped reed into ink. Across deserts, mountains, jungles, and buried cities, the same question keeps returning. How did distant peoples, separated by oceans and centuries, leave behind works that still unsettle the modern mind? Walls assembled with an exactness that resists explanation. Temples tuned to sound as if built for the body as much as for prayer. Tombs filled with substances both sacred and lethal. Surgical knowledge, hydraulic precision, astronomical memory, and materials that seem to outlast the intentions of those who made them. Each wonder, by itself, can be called remarkable. Together, they begin to feel like a pattern. Perhaps the pattern is only our own hunger for meaning. Human beings are brilliant imitators of necessity. Give us stone, water, illness, stars, and time, and maybe we will always find our way toward the same inventions. That is the cautious answer, and sometimes the wisest one. But caution does not erase wonder. It only frames it. Because there are moments when the past feels less like a ladder and more like a shattered mirror. A reflection here, another there, pieces of knowledge appearing far apart, as though scattered by some forgotten event or carried by stories no map has preserved. We are left with objects that endure more faithfully than memory itself. This is not a search for forbidden truths or grand conspiracies. It is something quieter and perhaps more human. A journey through the places where certainty begins to thin. A meditation on what survives, what vanishes, and what the ancient world may still be trying to tell us if we are patient enough to listen. What if the first clue was not a monument, but a mountain of shattered glass? In the desert near ancient cities, archaeologists have found traces of heat so intense that ordinary explanation begins to strain. Sand transformed, brick hardened beyond expectation, surfaces altered as if fire, pressure, and time had entered into some brief and violent agreement. We are often told to imagine the ancient world in muted colors, mud walls, smoke, worn tools, slow invention. But the evidence does not always feel humble. Sometimes it feels abrupt, almost industrial in its confidence. At sites linked to Mesopotamia and the broader cradle of urban life, the story grows more complicated the closer we look. These were not primitive experiments at civilization. They were societies of planners, record keepers, astronomers, merchants, and engineers. They managed water with a precision that could decide life or famine. They organized labor, measured seasons, and built cities not as accidents, but as systems. Their survival depended on exact knowledge carried from one generation to the next, fragile as breath and durable as clay. And yet, between what they achieved and what we assume they should have known, a gap remains. That gap is where imagination often rushes in. Some see lost sciences. Others see the ordinary brilliance of patient observation stretched across centuries. Both responses reveal something about us. We are uncomfortable with intelligence that does not look modern. We expect progress to resemble our own machines, our own language of proof. When ancient people produce extraordinary results without our tools, we hesitate. Then we mythologize. But perhaps the more unsettling possibility is simpler. Maybe knowledge has always moved in waves, gathering force, then breaking apart. Maybe entire methods of making, healing, building and measuring once lived inside human hands, not books, and vanished when those hands were gone. If so, the ruins before us are not only remnants of cities, they are the outlines of disciplines we no longer fully recognize. So the question deepens. When we uncover an ancient achievement that seems ahead of its time, are we discovering a mystery in the past or a blind spot in ourselves? It started, in one sense, with stone that seemed to remember how it wanted to fit. High in the Andes, where wind moves across the earth like a long, unfinished sentence, walls still stand whose joints are so exact that even now they inspire disbelief. Blocks of different sizes, angled and interlocked, meet one another without mortar, as if each had been persuaded rather than forced. Earthquakes have come and gone. Empires have risen, fallen, and been renamed. Yet the stones remain, patient and composed. To call this merely architecture feels too small. These structures suggest a relationship with material that borders on intimacy. The builders understood weight, pressure, fracture, and balance with a fluency that did not need modern equations to become real. At sites across Peru and beyond, the same feeling returns, not just that something was built well, but that it was built with a way of thinking we only partially grasp. The achievement is visible. The method is less so. There are practical explanations, and they matter. Time, labor, experimentation, inherited technique, and deep local knowledge can produce wonders that later generations mistake for impossibility. That truth deserves respect. Ancient craftsmanship was not magic. It was human effort, refined until it looked miraculous. But even that sober understanding leaves us with a more subtle astonishment. How much skill can disappear when the chain of teaching is broken? How many techniques vanish not because they were impossible to repeat, but because history changed the subjects worth remembering? We live in an age that stores knowledge in clouds and servers, believing preservation is almost guaranteed. The ancient world trusted memory, apprenticeship, ritual, and repetition. Knowledge lived in bodies, in gestures, in the angle of a tool against stone, in the pause before impact. It could survive for centuries. It could also disappear in a single generation of conquest, drought, disease, or exile. So these walls ask something larger than how they were made. They ask what it means for intelligence to leave behind results without leaving behind instructions. And they ask whether civilization is measured only by what it creates, or also by what it manages to pass on. What if the sky was once the oldest library we knew? Long before satellites, observatories, or digital clocks, human beings looked upward and found not chaos, but order. The sun returned, the moon changed in faithful intervals. Certain stars rose at the edge of seasons like quiet messengers. Across the ancient world, from Mesoamerica to Egypt, from Mesopotamia to the Indian subcontinent, civilizations built their lives around these repeating lights. But they did more than admire them. They measured them, encoded them, and in some cases, aligned entire cities to their motion. There is something moving about that ambition. To build in stone, according to what can only be seen in light. Temples, pyramids, ceremonial roads, and sacred chambers became instruments as much as monuments. A shadow falling on one day of the year could carry political meaning, agricultural warning, and spiritual reassurance all at once. Architecture became a calendar. Ritual became a kind of astronomy spoken through the body. The heavens were not separate from daily life. They were woven into it. Modern people sometimes imagine ancient sky knowledge as mystical guesswork, half poetry and half fear. But that view underestimates the discipline required to notice slow patterns over generations. Accurate observation is not less impressive because it is old. It may be more impressive. These cultures tracked cycles with no lenses, no software, no artificial light drowning out the stars. They watched carefully enough for memory to become mathematics. And yet, the more precise the alignments, the more uneasy the question becomes. Were these separate civilizations simply responding to the same sky in the same human way? Very possibly. The stars belong to everyone. Similar needs can produce similar insights, but the recurrence of certain numerical rhythms, directional choices, and symbolic correspondences leaves behind an emotional residue harder to explain away. Not proof of hidden connection, but the feeling of a shared intuition stretching across distance. Perhaps that is the true wonder. Not that ancient peoples possessed impossible knowledge, but that they trusted the universe enough to study it with patience. In doing so, they left us structures that still catch the sun on the right morning, still point toward a vanished horizon of meaning. And maybe that is what knowledge first was. Not domination of the world, but careful attention to it. It began with water, as so much of civilization does. Not the gentle image of a river in sunlight, but water as a problem, a force, a promise, and a threat. Across ancient landscapes, people learned that survival depended not only on finding water, but on teaching it where to go. And somehow, long before modern pumps or concrete dams, they built systems that still seem almost improbable in their reach. Channels cut through stone, reservoirs placed with uncanny judgment, underground tunnels that carried cold water across dry land as if the earth itself had been persuaded to breathe. In places separated by vast distance, the same pattern appears. Cities flourished in terrain that should have limited them. Fields were fed in climates that swung between scarcity and flood. Water arrived in baths, homes, ceremonial spaces, and farmland through networks designed not merely for access, but for continuity. These were not improvised solutions. They were long negotiations with landscape, requiring mathematics, labor, and a refined understanding of slope, pressure, storage, and loss. What is striking is not only the technical achievement, but the worldview beneath it. To manage water on that scale is to imagine a future. It means trusting that a society will endure long enough to justify difficult work, whose full reward may come decades later. Aqueducts, canals, and cisterns are expressions of patience made visible. They reveal a civilization thinking beyond the season, beyond the ruler, perhaps even beyond the lifetime of the builders themselves. Still, their ruins also remind us how fragile mastery can be. A blocked channel, a neglected tunnel, a broken wall, a changing climate, an invading army. Any one of these could begin the unraveling. Water, once guided, becomes wild again. Systems collapse quietly at first, then all at once. A city that seemed permanent discovers how quickly order can dissolve when maintenance fails and memory thins. So these ancient hydraulic worlds leave us with a paradox. The more sophisticated the system, the more it depends on invisible care. Perhaps that is true of all civilizations. What appears strongest is often held together by habits no one notices until they stop. And in that sense, every aqueduct is more than an engineering feat. It is a question in stone. What must a people remember every day in order not to lose what sustains them? What if healing was one of humanity's first lost sciences? In tombs, temples, and forgotten settlements, Archaeologists have found traces of medicine that feel both intimate and astonishing. Skulls marked by careful surgery, bones that healed after intervention, teeth altered by deliberate hands, residues of plants once ground into remedies, and instruments whose purpose still hovers between ritual and clinical skill. The ancient world did not separate body, spirit, and cosmos the way modern medicine often does. To heal someone was not only to treat pain, but to restore balance to the body, the family, the season, even the unseen order of things. That unity can make ancient medicine seem mysterious to us, as though it belonged more to myth than knowledge. But the evidence suggests something more grounded. Observation mattered, repetition mattered, trial, error, memory, and practice mattered. People learned which herbs calmed fever, which minerals sealed wounds, which procedures relieved pressure, and which gestures of care gave the suffering a reason to endure another night. The language around these acts may have been sacred, but the results were often practical, sometimes remarkably effective. Still, many of these traditions disappeared not because they failed, but because history broke the line that carried them. Libraries burned, apprentices died, languages vanished. Conquest replaced local understanding with foreign systems. What survives is uneven. A recipe here, an instrument there, a body showing signs of survival after a procedure we were not supposed to expect from its era. We are left with fragments of competence, like hearing only a few notes of a song and realizing it must once have been complete. There is humility in that realization. Modern medicine has accomplished extraordinary things, but it also tempts us to imagine the past as medically helpless, waiting for science to rescue it from ignorance. The truth is more layered. Ancient people suffered greatly, yes, but they also studied suffering with patience, courage, and ingenuity. Their knowledge was not lesser because it was incomplete. Ours is incomplete too, only dressed in newer language. So the question lingering in these ancient wounds and recoveries is not whether the past knew everything. It is whether we have mistaken continuity for progress and forgotten how many ways human beings have always tried to keep one another alive. It started with color that should not have lasted, in tomb chambers sealed from weather, on temple walls touched by centuries of dust, on fragments of cloth and pottery lifted from the earth. Ancient pigments still hold their voice. Blues remain deep. Reds keep their warmth. Blacks resist fading. Even now, they seem less like decoration than a message sent forward through time. We were here, and we knew how to make beauty endure. Color in the ancient world was never merely aesthetic. It marked status, devotion, mourning, power, protection, and memory. A mineral ground into powder, a plant reduced to dye, a secret mixture fired at the right heat. These were not small achievements. They required chemistry before chemistry had a name. People observed how substances changed when burned, crushed, soaked, combined, exposed to sunlight, or sealed from air. They learned not only how to make color, but how to bind it to plaster, cloth, skin, and stone, so that it became part of the object rather than a surface resting on it. That is where the mystery deepens. Again and again, ancient artisans produced materials whose durability still unsettles us. Certain concretes grow stronger with time. Certain pigments resist decay with improbable grace. Certain metal objects survive corrosion longer than expected. None of this requires fantasy. It requires respect. These makers lived close to their materials. They understood slowness, proportion, and process. Their workshops were laboratories of repetition, where failure taught as much as success. But when the people disappear, the recipe often disappears with them. A finished wall can survive 1,000 years, while the method used to create it vanishes in a single lifetime. That is one of history's cruelest habits. Results remain. Instructions do not. We inherit artifacts without apprenticeship, outcomes without the living chain of correction and touch that once made them possible. So when we stand before an ancient surface that still shines, we are not only seeing technical skill, we are seeing the human wish to outlast erasure, to leave behind not just proof of life, but proof of care. And maybe that is why these materials feel so moving even now. They remind us that civilization is not built only from conquest or invention, but from the quiet desire to make something beautiful enough and strong enough to survive our absence. What if sound was once understood as a form of architecture? Walk into certain ancient chambers, and the air seems to behave differently. A whisper travels farther than it should. A footstep returns not as an echo, but as a second presence. In some temples, theaters, and stone enclosures, acoustics feel less accidental than intentional, as if the builders knew that space could shape emotion long before physics offered the language to describe it. This possibility matters because sound was never just entertainment. In the ancient world, voice carried authority, memory, ritual, and belonging. A prayer had to be heard. A ruler's words had to reach the crowd. Music had to bind ceremony to feeling. To design a place where sound gathered, amplified, softened, or lingered was to shape collective experience itself. Architecture did not only hold bodies, it held attention. At sites scattered across different continents, researchers and visitors have noticed these strange sonic effects. A clap becomes a bird-like pulse. A chant deepens in enclosed stone. Certain platforms seem to project speech with surprising clarity. Of course, not every effect proves deliberate design. Sometimes form produces beauty by chance. A stairway, a dome, a narrow corridor may create acoustic patterns no one planned in full. Yet even chance becomes meaningful when generations choose to keep building in ways that preserve it. Here again, the past resists simple categories. Was this science, ritual, artistry, or all three at once? Ancient people may not have measured frequency the way we do, but they knew what spaces did to the human body. They could feel how vibration alters breath, posture, memory, and awe. Knowledge does not become less real because it begins in sensation. Sometimes sensation is where knowledge begins. What lingers in these sounding stones is a larger thought about civilization itself. We often judge old societies by what they left for the eye. Walls, carvings, roads, tools. But human life is also built from the invisible, from rhythm, resonance, and the emotional force of a shared voice rising inside a designed space. Perhaps some of the most important ancient knowledge was never meant to be seen at all. Perhaps it was meant to be heard, felt, and carried away inside the body, where memory lasts longest. It began with roads, currents, and the stubborn restlessness of human beings. Long before the modern map imagined the world as neatly bordered, people were already moving across it, carrying obsidian, salt, metals, seeds, stories, myths, measurements, and techniques tucked into memory. Civilizations that seem isolated when viewed from a textbook often look different when viewed through trade. Suddenly, the distance between them begins to shrink. Not because oceans vanish or deserts soften, but because curiosity has always been one of humanity's most reliable vehicles. This is where the old mystery of connection begins to breathe. Similar symbols appear in distant places. Building methods echo across continents. Ritual objects suggest related instincts. Crops, dyes, alloys, and ideas emerge far from their points of origin. None of this requires a single lost empire or some grand, hidden network guiding the world from the shadows. It may simply reveal what humans do best: borrow, adapt, reinterpret, and carry forward what proves useful or beautiful. Contact does not need to be constant to be transformative. A rare exchange can alter centuries, and yet something more intimate may be happening beneath the evidence. Even where direct contact is uncertain, civilizations often converge on similar answers to similar questions. How do we honor the dead? How do we align ourselves with the sky? How do we organize labor, mark time, store food, heal wounds, and shape stone into permanence? Perhaps resemblance is not always proof of transmission. Perhaps it is proof of shared human structure, the repeating architecture of need, wonder, and fear. Still, trade routes did more than move goods. They moved imagination. A traveler arrives with an unfamiliar tool, a different story of the stars, a new way of tempering metal or preserving grain. The receiving culture does not copy it exactly. It translates it into local life. In that translation, something original is born. Civilization, then, is not a closed invention. It is a conversation, often fragmented, somehow silent for centuries, yet never fully ended. So when ancient worlds seem mysteriously linked, the answer may not be hidden at all. It may lie in the oldest truth of history, that people have always been reaching beyond the horizon, and that every horizon cross-changes both the traveler and the shore that receives them. What if the deepest mystery is not how ancient civilizations rose, but how they were forgotten? We tend to imagine collapse as a dramatic event: walls breached, fires spreading, monuments falling in a single night. Sometimes it was, but more often, decline seems to arrive like dusk. A canal silts up. A harvest fails twice in a row. A trade route shifts. A language loses prestige. Children inherit ruins before anyone is willing to call them ruins. And slowly, what was once central becomes remote, then sacred, then misunderstood. Archaeology often begins where memory ends. A buried city is discovered not because history preserved it well, but because history let it slip away. That is why the ancient world can feel so unsettling. It reminds us that disappearance does not always mean annihilation. Sometimes a civilization survives in altered forms, through myths, borrowed techniques, inherited place names, religious gestures, fragments of lore, and habits no one can fully trace. The people do not vanish. The coherence does. What is lost is the pattern that once made life intelligible. This matters because we still live inside that same vulnerability. Our age feels durable because it is documented so obsessively. We record, upload, archive, duplicate. We trust storage. But storage is not the same as remembrance. An unread record is only another buried chamber. The ancients carved into stone because they feared oblivion. We write into systems because we fear the same thing, even if we use newer tools and tell ourselves a different story. There is also a tenderness in what survives. A child's footprint hardened in clay. A repaired bowl. A wall painted for no purpose except beauty. A skeleton laid carefully beside beads, tools, flowers, or food. These remains shift the meaning of lost civilization. They remind us that history is not only about kings, engineers, and monuments. It is about ordinary people trying to make a life that feels meaningful before time carries it elsewhere. So perhaps the question is no longer whether ancient knowledge disappeared. Of course, some of it did. The more difficult question is what allows any human world to be remembered at all. Is it power? Is it permanence? Or is it the fragile hope that someone, far in the future, will find our traces and understand that we too were trying to build something worthy of being kept? It started with the temptation to explain too much. Whenever the ancient world confronts us with something elegant, difficult, or strangely ahead of expectation, the modern imagination often divides in two. One voice says there must be a hidden answer, some lost master key, some vanished source of superior knowledge connecting everything. The other insists there is no mystery at all, only coincidence, exaggeration, and the ordinary labor of human hands. Between those extremes lies a more demanding truth. The past is neither magical nor simple. It is complex enough to resist our need for tidy conclusions. That complexity is not a failure of understanding. It is part of what makes history worth studying. A buried structure, an undeciphered symbol, a recipe whose result survives but whose method is gone. These do not only frustrate us, they reveal the limits of evidence itself. We are always reconstructing from fragments. A civilization can leave behind its bones and still keep its inner life hidden. We may know what people built, traded, worshipped, or ate, yet remain uncertain about how they understood their own achievements. And perhaps that uncertainty deserves more respect than it usually receives. To say we do not fully know is not to weaken the story. It is to tell the truth about discovery. Science, archaeology, and historical inquiry are strongest not when they pretend certainty, but when they hold evidence carefully and leave room for revision. In that sense, doubt is not the enemy of knowledge. It is one of its oldest disciplines. This matters because mystery can be used in two very different ways. It can become spectacle, turning the past into entertainment built from exaggerated claims. Or it can become an invitation to humility, reminding us that intelligence has always exceeded the categories available to describe it. Ancient civilizations do not need to be made supernatural to be extraordinary. Their real achievement is already enough. They found ways to live, build, heal, observe, remember, and imagine under conditions we can barely recover. So the question now is not whether every mystery will be solved. It is whether we can bear to let the past remain partially open, unfinished, unresolved, and therefore alive. Because sometimes the most honest way to honor what came before us is not to conquer its silence, but to listen to it more carefully. What if the real connection between ancient civilizations was not a secret technology, but a shared way of facing the unknown? Again and again, across continents that may never have spoken directly, human communities responded to existence with the same deep gestures. They raised stones toward the sky. They buried their dead with care. They aligned daily life with seasons, stars, water, and memory. They turned fear into ritual, observation into knowledge, and survival into meaning. The details varied. The impulse did not. Seen this way, the parallels between distant societies become less eerie and more intimate. Similar achievements need not point to a hidden master civilization. They may point to something more profound, the recurring shape of the human mind under pressure from time, mortality, and wonder. Give people enough generations, enough need, and enough attention, and they will begin to discover patterns in the world and in themselves. They will invent calendars, medicines, songs, maps, and monuments not because they were instructed by some vanished authority, but because being human has always meant searching for structure inside uncertainty. That does not make the ancient world less mysterious. It makes it more moving, because the resemblance we see across civilizations may be a mirror rather than a clue. Their questions were our questions in earlier form. How do we remember what matters? How do we live with death? How do we make knowledge last longer than a lifetime? How do we belong to a world that is beautiful, dangerous, and never fully explained? The ruins answer only partially, but even their silence feels familiar. In that sense, every excavation is also an encounter with ourselves. The stone observatory, the engineered canal, the healing herb, the long enduring pigment, the precisely cut wall, each one is a record of attention. Someone stood where we stand now, noticed what mattered, and tried to preserve it against forgetting. That effort, repeated across time and geography, may be the oldest thread linking civilization to civilization. So perhaps the hidden bond was never science alone, nor trade alone, nor myth alone. Perhaps it was the enduring human refusal to let the world remain meaningless. And perhaps that refusal is the one inheritance no collapse has ever fully erased. It begins to feel by now less like a catalogue of ancient enigmas and more like a meditation on endurance. Not endurance in the heroic sense, but in the quieter human one. A wall that remains standing, a medical practice remembered in fragments, a canal line still visible from the air, a pigment still luminous after centuries of darkness. These are not simply relics, they are acts of continuity. However broken, reaching across time with more grace than certainty. And what they reveal is not a vanished perfection. Ancient civilizations were vulnerable, unequal, often harsh, and deeply mortal. They suffered drought, war, disease, hierarchy, and error, just as later societies would. Their knowledge was partial, their worlds unstable, their futures uncertain. Yet perhaps that is what makes their achievements so affecting. They did not build from comfort. They built from precarity. Out of instability, they made calendars. Out of danger, they made medicine. Out of impermanence, they made monuments that still alter the way we imagine the human past. This is where the old question shifts one final time. Maybe science cannot fully explain every connection because explanation itself has limits. Evidence can trace roots, date materials, compare structures, test residues, and model probabilities. All of that matters. But there remains another layer, harder to quantify, the emotional logic of civilization. Why people everywhere keep trying to wrest order from chaos. Why they carve patterns into stone, listen for meaning in the sky, and leave behind objects shaped not only by utility, but by reverence. The ancient world is connected not just by trade or technique, but by aspiration. That may be the most important thing these cultures hand to us. Not a secret formula, not a lost machine, not a final answer, but an example of attention. They looked closely at matter, weather, stars, illness, death, and memory. They asked how to live well inside forces larger than themselves. Their answers were incomplete. Ours will be too. So as we approach the final threshold of this journey, one thought remains. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not what ancient civilizations knew, but what they understood about being human that we are still trying, in our own language, to remember. So where does this leave us? After the stone walls, the celestial alignments, the vanished techniques, the healing fragments, the engineered waters, the durable colors, the resonant chambers, the hidden roots of exchange, and the long quiet after collapse. Perhaps here, standing at the edge of history with a little less certainty and a little more reverence. The ancient world has not yielded a single secret that explains everything. It has offered something more valuable than that. It has reminded us that human beings have always been far more observant, inventive, and reflective than later ages often allow. What joins these civilizations is not proof of some perfect lost age. It is the repeated evidence of serious minds meeting a difficult world. Again and again, people who lacked our machines still developed ways to measure the sky, shape the land, preserve materials, carry memory, and care for one another. They did so with patience, discipline, and a closeness to natural systems that modern life sometimes forgets. Their achievements survive not because they were superhuman, but because they were deeply human, rooted in attention, cooperation, ritual, trial, and hope. And maybe that is the final lesson. Civilization is not a straight ascent from ignorance to mastery. It is a fragile conversation between generations. Knowledge appears, gathers force, disperses, and sometimes returns in altered form. What one era calls progress, another may inherit only as debris. What seems obvious now may one day become an undeciphered artifact. The past does not sit behind us, finished and silent. It moves beside us, asking whether we know how to keep what matters from being lost. If there is a timeless question running through all these ruins, it may be this: what do human beings owe the future? Not only better tools, not only stronger buildings. Perhaps we owe it memory shaped with care, knowledge passed on clearly, beauty made honestly, humility in the face of what we do not yet understand. Because one day, others may study us the way we study the ancients, searching our remains for proof that we, too, were listening for meaning in the dark. And if they do, perhaps the truest inheritance we can leave is not certainty, but curiosity that endures.